Episode 170. They could see the bottom of the two Death Eaters' robes drawing nearer, their feet moving rapidly.
"They might have run straight through to the hall,"
said the rough voice.
"Check under the desks,"
said another. Harry saw the knees of the Death Eaters bend. Poking his wand out from under the desk, he shouted, "Stupefy!" A jet of red light hit the nearest Death Eater. He fell backward into a grandfather clock and knocked it over. The second Death Eater, however, had leapt aside to avoid Harry's spell, and now pointed his own wand at Hermione, who had crawled out from under the desk to get a better aim.
"Avada!"
Harry launched himself across the floor and grabbed the Death Eater around the knees, causing him to topple and his aim to go awry. Neville overturned his desk in his anxiety to help, pointing his wand wildly, and at the struggling pair he cried,
"Expelliarmus!"
Both Harry's and the Death Eater's wands flew out of their hands and soared back toward the entrance to the Hall of Prophecy. Both scrambled to their feet and charged after them, the Death Eater in front and Harry hot on his heels. Neville bringing up the rear, plainly horror-struck at what he had done.
"Get out of the way, Harry!"
yelled Neville, clearly determined to repair the damage. Harry flung himself sideways as Neville took aim again and shouted,
"Stupefy!"
The jet of red light flew right over the Death Eater's shoulder and hit a glass-fronted cabinet on the wall, full of variously shaped hourglasses. The cabinet fell to the floor and burst apart, glass flying everywhere, then sprang back up onto the wall, fully mended, then fell down again and shattered. The Death Eater had snapped up his wand, which lay on the floor beside the glittering bell jar. Harry ducked down behind another desk as the man turned. His mask had slipped so that he could not see. He ripped it off his face with his free hand and shouted,
"Stupefy!"
screamed Hermione, who had just caught up with them. The jet of red light hit the Death Eater in the middle of his chest. He froze, his arm still raised. His wand fell to the floor with a clatter, and he collapsed backward toward the bell jar. Harry expected to hear a clunk, for the man to hit solid glass and slide off the jar onto the floor. But instead, his head sank through the surface of the bell jar as though it was nothing but a soap bubble, and he came to rest, sprawled on his back on the table with his head lying inside the jar, full of glittering wind.
"Accio wand!"
cried Hermione. Harry's wand flew from a dark corner into her hand, and she threw it at him. "Thanks," he said. "Right, let's get out of here."
"Look out!" said Neville,
horrified, staring at the Death Eater's head in the bell jar. All three of them raised their wands again, but none of them struck. They were all gazing, open-mouthed, appalled at what was happening to the man's head. It was shrinking very fast, growing balder and balder, the black hair and stubble retracting into his skull, his cheeks smooth, his skull round and covered with a peach-like fuzz. A baby's head now sat grotesquely on top of the thick, muscled neck of the Death Eater as he struggled to get up again. But even as they watched, their mouths open, the head began to swell to its previous proportions again. Thick black hair was sprouting from the pate and chin.
"It's time," said Hermione in an awestruck voice. "Time."
The Death Eater shook his ugly head again, trying to clear it, but before he could pull himself together again, it began to shrink back to babyhood once more. There was a shout from a room nearby, then a crash and a scream. "Ron!" Harry yelled, turning quickly from the monstrous transformation taking place before them. "Ginny? Luna?"
"Harry!"
Hermione screamed. The Death Eater had pulled his head out of the bell jar. His appearance was utterly bizarre, his tiny baby's head bawling loudly while his thick arms flailed dangerously in all directions, narrowly missing Harry, who ducked. Harry raised his wand, but to his amazement, Hermione seized his arm.
"You can't hurt a baby."
There was no time to argue the point. Harry could hear more footsteps growing louder from the Hall of Prophecy they had just left, and knew, too late, that he ought not to have shouted and given away their position. "Come on," he said again, and leaving the ugly baby-headed Death Eater staggering behind them, they took off for the door that stood ajar at the other end of the room, leading back into the black hallway. They had run halfway toward it when Harry saw through the open door 2 more Death Eaters running across the black room toward them. Veering left, he burst instead into a small, dark, cluttered office and slammed the door behind them.
"Color,"
began Hermione, but before she could complete the spell, the door had burst open again, and the 2 Death Eaters had come hurtling inside. With a cry of triumph, both yelled, "Impedimenta!" Harry, Hermione, and Neville were all knocked backward off their feet. Neville was thrown over the desk and disappeared from view. Hermione smashed into a bookcase and was promptly deluged in a cascade of heavy books. The back of Harry's head slammed into a stone wall behind him. Tiny lights burst in front of his eyes, and for a moment he was too dizzy and bewildered to react.
"We've got him,"
yelled the Death Eater nearest Harry.
"In an office off." "Silencio!"
cried Hermione, and the man's voice was extinguished. He continued to mouth through the hole in his mask, but no sound came out. He was thrust aside by his fellow. "Petrificus totalis!" shouted Harry, as the second Death Eater raised his wand. His arms and legs snapped together, and he fell forward, face down, onto the rug at Harry's feet, stiff as a board and unable to move at all.
"Well done, Harry."
But the Death Eater Hermione had just struck dumb made a sudden slashing movement with his wand, from which flew a streak of what looked like purple flame. It passed right across Hermione's chest. She gave a tiny "oh," as though of surprise, and then crumpled onto the floor where she lay motionless. "Hermione!" Harry fell to his knees beside her as Neville crawled rapidly toward her from under the desk, his wand held up in front of him. The Death Eater kicked out hard at Neville's head as he emerged. His foot broke Neville's wand in 2 and connected with his face. Neville gave a howl of pain and recoiled, clutching his mouth and nose. Harry twisted around, his own wand held high, and saw the Death Eater had ripped off his mask and was pointing his wand directly at Harry, who recognized the long, pale, twisted face from the Daily Prophet. Antonin Dolohov, the wizard who had murdered the Pruitts. Dolohov grinned. With his free hand, he pointed from the prophecy still clutched in Harry's hand to himself, then at Hermione. Though he could no longer speak, his meaning could not have been clearer. "Give me the prophecy, or you get the same as her." "Like you won't kill us the moment I hand it over anyway," said Harry. A whine of panic inside his head was preventing him thinking properly. He had one hand on Hermione's shoulder, which was still warm, yet did not dare look at her properly. "Don't let her be dead. Don't let her be dead. It's my fault if she's dead."
"Whatever you do, Harry,"
said Neville fiercely from under the desk, lowering his hands to show a clearly broken nose and blood pouring down his mouth and chin,
"don't give it to him."
Then there was a crash outside the door, and Dolohov looked over his shoulder. The baby-headed Death Eater had appeared in the doorway, his head bawling, his great fists still flailing uncontrollably at everything around him. Harry seized his chance. "Petrificus totalis!" The spell hit Dolohov before he could block it, and he toppled forward across his comrade, both of them as rigid as boards and unable to move an inch. "Hermione," Harry said at once, shaking her as the baby-headed Death Eater blundered out of sight again. "Hermione, wake up!"